Okay, so yeah, so I'm doing my talk on HTTP2. And the kind of the theme of it is less is more. And the very first thing I need to do is actually change the title of my talk to H2, less is more, because we can actually shorten that. Anytime you actually hear anyone talk about HTTP2, they're not going to say that because that's a giant mouthful and no one likes to say complicated things. So we're just going to talk about H2. So if you open up your Chrome DevTools and you look for the protocol stuff in the network stack or the network tab, you're going to see references to H2. That literally means HTTP2. So again, like Riaz said, my name is Ricky Smith. You can catch me on Twitter and LinkedIn and whatever else you want. @Digitally Born is usually the name I use online. Feel free to email me if you so desire. Ricky@Rigor, doesn't get much easier than that. I work for Rigor. I'm actually the senior DevOps engineer, so I help lead up a lot of our operational whatnots to manage our infrastructure. And I'm also one of the technical advisors here at the Tech Village. So before I can really dive into what HTTP2 is, or H2, so let's just cover a little bit of what HTTP1 is. So let's recap real quick. So I'm assuming that everyone here is a Ruby dev, and you probably deal with the web. So you probably know that the web, and specifically HTTP1, is a request and response based protocol, right? So your browser, the client, connects to a server, makes a request, the server processes the request, and gives you a response. It kind of looks like this sweet animation. I love these animations, and I'm going to show them as many times as I possibly can, right? So again, our client makes a connection. It sends a request for HTML, the server processes it, sends the response, the browser parses the HTML, determines there's additional resources, opens additional TCP connections, makes those new requests on those additional TCP connections. The server then processes those requests, sends the response, right? Pretty straightforward. I think we're pretty accustomed to most of that by now. That's what happens. It's invisible. Everything's kind of the way that it is, right? So what exactly is H2? So it is kind of the natural upgrade to HTTP 1.1, right? It's entirely backwards compatible, entirely, right? Like there's actually a chance that some of you in this room have been upgraded to H2 and you don't actually even know it, right? Every browser that's out there, all the major browsers already support it. A lot of web tools already support it. Curl already supports it. There's just a lot of adoption already. And because it's backwards compatible and because all these tools already use it and a lot of services already support it, like I said, if you're using like a CDN or something like that, it might actually be turned on and you just haven't even noticed it and you've gotten a lot of the benefits from it, right? So again, like any browser that can use it will start to use it and it's kind of free real estate, right? So to really show what the difference is, first let's cover what's the same, right? So URLs are the same, right? How you address things are exactly the same. Domain names, paths, ports, schemes, all the same. HTTP verbs are the same. Oh, I skipped one. HTTP verbs are the same. You did a get before, you're going to do a get now. Status codes also the same. 200 is okay, 400 is not found, etc. Headers are still a key value pair. Everything that you know and love about HTTP still applies. Great. Also, Mime types, essentially your server telling the client, the browser, what kind of data it's sending it, exactly the same, right? If it was a text HTML before, it's text HTML now. You're all happy, right? What you knew transfers over. But there are some differences. So here it is. First of all, it's a binary protocol. If you're the type, and I think one of you at least is, who likes watching network traffic on the wire, and you're used to seeing HTML come across it and nice, pretty plain text that you can just read in like a Wireshark. Bad news, you're not going to see that pretty plain text anymore because now it's binary. The reason it's binary is a lot easier to compress, it's a lot smaller, it's a lot easier for serializers, there's a lot of benefits to it. Now it's binary, right? It's also a single TCP connection, right? And this is kind of an important deal, and I'll cover a little bit more, because if you remember in my first suite animation, we opened additional TCP connections. I'll tell you why we did that, and why we're not going to do that anymore, and why that's great. Also, headers are now compressed. In HTTP 1, all your headers were actually uncompressed, right? Like you may have spent a lot of time gzipping your response bodies, right? Gzipping your CSS and your HTML. Guess what? All your headers, that massive amount of cookie data that you passed back and forth between client and browser, none of that was actually compressed. So that's just a ton of waste on the wire. Now it gets to be compressed, right? So moving on to the one thing that I flirted with, the TCP connection. There are some penalties to TCP connections. So again, back to my HTTP 1.1 connection animation, we created a TCP connection. We made the requests. Server processes the thing, gives us the response. We parse the thing, and if you notice, the very first request or TCP connection makes the initial request for that first batch, or the second batch of resources before the second and third TCP connections are even open and available, right? So already we can actually see that that first connection that was already open is kind of the optimized connection, right? It's already got a thing going for it. It's established, right? Because there's actually a penalty. There's a time that it takes to establish each TCP connection, right? It gets worse if we have SSL on this site, right? Because now we have to do TLS handshake on top of each and every TCP connection. So opening up additional TCP connections actually penalizes us with time. And time is not something that we want to spend. There is also a thing called the TCP Slow-Start, right? TCP is a very old protocol, and it started when connections were very, very small. But it was really smart in how they designed it. They designed it to start slow and then get faster, to grow automatically to the size of a connection, right? So every single time you connect to a server over TCP, the server is going to respond in a very, very slow way, right? And this is very low level in TCP. It's going to start slow, and it's going to slowly ramp up the speed, right? And so, again, there's another inherent penalty in opening up a second TCP connection. It's going to have to go through that same slow start, where it starts slow and then ramps up. If we can, we would much rather use a TCP connection that's open, it's already ramped up, it's already fast, we already have incurred those penalties once, we want to reuse those, right? And because of these penalties, because of some of these limitations, actually a limitation I didn't mention, which was the reason that we open multiple TCP connections is because each of these request and response back and forth, the communication, is actually blocking, right? While this first request is on the wire, we can't make a second request, right? That connection is actually completely blocked, waiting for the server to process the response and then deliver it to us. And until that entire giant header image or hero image is transferred from the server to me, I can't reuse that TCP connection, right? So that's why we opened up additional connections right now. But there's a limit to that, which is for each host, we can only open up 6 TCP connections, right? This is just like kind of a natural limitation, not natural, but it's part of the specification that we can only open 6. And it used to not actually be 6, it used to be smaller, and we've increased that because the web is bigger and more complex now than ever, right? So essentially all of this kind of adds up to your browser, it's begging for more content, it's crying for love, right? And we want to give it those hugs. So this is kind of what HTTP 2 looks like. We now open up one big single TCP connection that's super fat. The browser makes the request, the server processes it, and sends the response. The browser then says, hey, I need more additional resources. It can now send those multiple requests at the same time on the same TCP connection. The server can process those requests in parallel and then respond to them on the same TCP connection. And it does this by actually breaking up both the requests and the response into smaller bits we call frames, right? And it's the same kind of underlying technology that goes along with WebSockets.
What are they called?
Frames. Yep. So you can kind of imagine now that there's there's actually some benefit, like some really big performance benefits to doing this, right? Like the TLS handshake, we only did it once. We don't have to do it again. We've already done the TCP connection delay. We've already incurred that penalty once. We don't have to do it again. The TCP Slow-Start, we've done it once. Again, we don't have to do it again. We have a hot, ramped up, fast internet connection, a TCP connection that we can use for all of our requests, right? On top of that, H2 adds resource prioritization, where the browser can actually tell the server, hey, these resources, I need them in a specific order, right? Browsers are incredibly sophisticated these days, right? Browsers are really, really good at knowing what kinds of resources it needs first in order to render its content as quickly as possible, right? So it's able to actually say, hey, I need CSS first, and I need JavaScript last, and this hero image, it's above the fold, I need it first, these other images, they're below, I need them second, right? The browser is able to do that on the fly. So H2 kind of empowers the browsers to really, at a protocol level, kind of improve upon that intelligence to really squeeze as much performance out of this whole back and forth process as it possibly can, right? So, that's some bad news. If you spent any time with your website that's hosted on HTTP 1.1, optimizing for performance, for doing all of the little dirty tricks that we all know and hate, you're doing it all wrong. You're doing it all wrong, right? So I have some rules for you, some new world rules. Stop domain sharding. If you don't know what this is, good news, I'm going to explain it to you. So domain sharding is, you've probably seen it if you've looked at somebody's site. And it's where they have a bunch of addresses that look like this. They won't all be pointing to the same Jquery file. But the idea is that you take essentially the same server, you map multiple domain names to it, and you give them some silly A.cdn and B.cdn to make you sound like you're worldwide and global and big hot stuff. And you essentially share the same resources across multiple domains. This is a trick. This is a trick to let the browser open not 6 connections, but 18 connections, because it's multiple domains, and it's 6 per domain. So now, because my site is silly and I have giant images and I have 1,000 of them, now I can absolutely max out the connection list with a ton of TCP connections so that I can maximize how much I download. You don't need to do this anymore. In fact, this is bad. Don't do it. It actually works worse in H2. The best way is to literally drop all of those subdomains entirely, host everything on your main domain. Again, it's now in your best interest to use that single big fat TCP connection. It's open, it's available, use it. Use it. To the same end, stop using icon sprites. We used to do this thing, right? Where we'd have one giant image with 1,000 icons, and we'd use little CSS rules to only show the little square exactly where we want. That's bad. It's terrible. It's bad, because if we ever change one pixel down here, we've invalidated the cache for the whole thing. Right? Now our customers have to download this giant image of icons. And guess what? I only really needed this arrow right here. I didn't need all those icons, right? And again, now we don't have to do that, because making small individual calls, because they're broken into frames, it's not really a penalty anymore. So now we can break up those files individually. We can have those individual icons cached. We can only request the ones that we need when our customers need them. We can be a lot faster in how we do things, right? To the same end, we can stop concatenating. You can stop taking all of those CSS files and combining them into one mybigwebsite.css, and you can now focus on creating individual CSS files that match your exact customer's needs at any given time. Because again, there's no real penalty in asking for new resources, but there is kind of an upfront penalty in shipping too much to the client, right? So the mindset is shifting. You don't have to send so much upfront. You can reuse the connection now. It also favors, again, caching. You'll hear me say this word a lot. It favors caching because you can cache those individual files, and if you make updates, you only invalidate the cached resources that you need to touch. And so your cache coverage is a lot better, right? And for the love of God, stop using jQuery CDN. Just stop. Like the idea of jQuery CDN, if you don't know, or any like JavaScript CDN, the idea was like, hey, Riaz has a website and I have a website. It wouldn't be great if a user who came from Riaz's site to my site already had the jQuery library in their cache because we both served it up from the same CDN, right? It's a great idea in theory, but in practice, there's a billion different versions of jQuery, right? And there's minified, the same billion is minified, and the same version is light, and the same version is light minified. And the chances of the same user going from Riaz's site to my site and needing exactly the same file, and also there's 10,000 different CDNs, so the idea that they're gonna ask for exactly the same file from the CDN is astronomical. Not only that, but the dirty secret is files don't stay in a browser's cache for all that long. You can really only guarantee, and not even guarantee at that point, that something stays in a browser's cache for about 24 hours, right? Like, we ask so much from browser's cache. Like, our customers and our users are downloading so much data with such a limited amount of cache on disk that it's just gonna throw all that crap away when it fills up, right? So by the time they get back to our site, they've already filled their cache. All of what we put in there has already been thrown out, and they're gonna have to download it anyway. So even if we tell them, cache this for 1,000,000 years, they're not gonna have it. So jQuery CDN is a terrible idea. Great in idea, terrible in practice, I should say. Yeah, so you do these things, your site will be faster. That's kind of it, that's it. All right, so the most important thing, how? Like, I've ripped through what HTTP2 is in crazy speed, right? This guy speed. So how? You guys are Ruby, so this is about to be for you, but before that, I want to give you a note about SSL, and specifically TLS, because no one ought to say SSL anymore. Browser makers they've been dying for an excuse to force us all to use SSL. And for good reason. Privacy is important, right? The problem is, historically, SSL has been really expensive, right? Like when I started doing this almost years ago, certificates were like 200 bucks a piece for one domain, right? Like you had to be a big company selling a lot of stuff to afford a certificate, and that even at that point, you only put it on your checkout page, right? Because it was slow, and it was terrible, and it was complex to set up, and it was super expensive, right? It's not that world anymore, right? SSL's free. Like anyone can get this. Like CDNs will terminate SSL for nothing. There's Let's Encrypt. There's a lot of great things out there. There's absolutely no reason that you shouldn't be using SSL. And now, because we were changing protocols from HTTP 1 to H2, browser makers got together somehow and agreed, now's the time, even though it's not part of the specification, we as browser makers are going to force our users and say, we're not actually going to support H2. We're not going to start talking H2 unless it's over TLS, unless it's over an SSL connection. So the short and skinny of it is, if you want H2, you need it. But again, you ought to have it anyway, because it's free. And the good news is, there's kind of a penalty in performance whenever you add SSL. So if you're not there, you can expect to take a little bit of a performance hit. The kind of goodish news is that the penalty for SSL is almost exactly offset by moving to H2. So if you were waiting for SSL and saying like, I don't want to take that performance hit, now's the moment. Because you can do both and essentially invalidate the two, nullify the two, right? And if you're already using SSL and you're not on H2, guess what? Bonus. Okay, so again, back to the room. We're all Ruby developers, so what about Rack? I got bad news. It's not happening. Rack right now has zero support for H2. It's literally one of the few things. Fundamentally, how it's designed, not really compatible with H2. There's a lot of discussion about supporting it in Rack 2.0. It's still up in the air. Even the discussion, like no one's really set on even it being a goal of Rack 2.0. My read of the situation is probably not going to happen anytime soon. But it's fine, because if you use Nginx, this is what your configuration looks like. I don't know if you could tell, but it's really easy. Literally all you do, if you already have SSL, is add the word HTTP2 to your listen statement. That's literally all you have to do, right? If you use Apache, it's equally as easy. You load a module and you change your protocols to include H2. Literally, that's it. That is it. If you use a CDN, even better news. Everyone supports it. Literally everyone. If you have a CDN and it's not running, there's probably a checkbox you don't know exists. Go check it. So again, there's some performance gains. You know, I kind of covered this. 1 TCP Slow-Start, 1 TLS, and better caching of small files, right? So I'm going to take a step back. When I originally proposed this talk, it made me realize that I live in a little bit of a performance bubble. And I know a little bit more about this than I probably ought to talk about. And so when I proposed this to Riaz at the last Ruby meetup, the talk was actually supposed to be not about HTTP2 in general, but actually like one specific feature of H2 and why it sucks and it's terrible. And so the real talk that I wanted to get to, I get to have now because I've kind of covered all the stuff that I wanted to. So the real talk is H2 server push, the little engine that shouldn't. So there is a feature in HTTP2 called server push, and it answers a very interesting problem, right? Again, about performance. So going back, our HTTP1 and our HTTP2 animations, you'll remember it's a request and response, right? We request a thing, the server processes the thing, we process the thing, we ask for additional things based on what we processed, right? There is a fundamental performance gain staring us in the face, and we're so used to seeing this animation already because I love them, that we don't see it. And that is, I'm the server. I know what the browser needs. I know they're about to ask me for those 3 additional resources. Why can't I just give them to them? Why can't during, like right after the first request, I just send all of it? They're gonna need it, right? That's exactly what server push is. It's the idea that you open up your big H2 connection, you make your request, the server goes, you're gonna need all 4 of these things, and it just jams them over, right? And the browser takes all that stuff that you've given it to us. Again, it hasn't processed the HTML yet. It accepts all those files, stuffs it into the browser cache, parses the HTML like normal, and then the browser's networking stack, essentially, as it's parsing, it goes, hey, network stack, I need this URL. Network stack goes, I've got this in cache, let me just give it to you. That's a great thing the very first time a person comes to your site. But what about the second time they come to your site? The second time, there's a big old caching problem, right? So the big caching problem is they've already got those resources, right? So if you're shipping, 20 megs of images, which is actually small these days, you're just wasting the resources, pushing resources to the client that they've already got, right? I mean, that's the idea of server push, is to push stuff to them. But there's a fundamental problem is that they don't need it. They've already got it, but you can't tell that because you're the server. So in a big way, it's kind of a broken, half-implemented feature. Word on the street is actually that Chrome is going to drop support for it soon, which is shocking because it would be in violation of the specifications. But it's Google, who cares, right? So if you've heard about server push and you've gone, that's probably a thing that I want, close your laptop and go to sleep. Yeah, that's pretty much it. I ripped through that pretty quick. Do we have any questions? I got nothing. Yeah.
So in the H2 world, we now have clients having this beefy channel to which they can send out requests at the speed of light with no throttling.
Yeah.
Does that mean it's easier for clients to spam your app if you have a lot of users, a lot of active sessions? Do you need to consider making your app more responsive, upgrading to a beefier server?
So I think the question is the additional load of being able to ask for more resources require us to have more server resources to handle all that?
It's now in the H2 world, it's easier for clients to intentionally or unintentionally DOS your site.
Yeah. I mean, so I would argue that it's probably no different than it is in the HTTP1 world, except there's kind of an unnatural throttle to it, right? Because ultimately, when you have those 6 connections open and they're all high speed, once they've ramped up in speed, you know, you're going to get essentially the same throughput, right? So like it's like the DDoS thing doesn't really happen until you have, you know, an influx of, you know, traffic that's unexpected. I don't think so. I've never heard of anyone saying that they've had to upgrade their infrastructure or upgrade their server resources because of switching on H2. I don't think it's that dramatic server side to handle in most cases. But if that's the case, slap a CDN on it and the problem kind of goes away.
How long does the fat TCP connection stay open? In theory, you could have, is it just a WebSocket that's open forever? Does that cause like TCP/IP queue starvation, where now you have to have ability to handle more connections?
Yeah, so the question is how long essentially is that single to rule them all TCP connection left open? I think it follows pretty much the same kind of conventions as HTTP 1 in that it will eventually time out and close. It's kind of, I think, up to the browser's discretion. I don't think it's going to stick around too long. I don't think it'll be for the whole session. But it is kind of up to the browser, because I mean, if the user is moving pretty quick, you know, the networking stack is going to keep the connection open as long as it can.
Always should have 5-minute long hyper-active visitors on our sites, right?
Yeah, I mean that is a good problem to survive. Yes. Yeah.
So what about like front-end build tooling? Because like all of our build tooling is, like you said, concatenating everything. Like Webpack is
Yeah.
the entire job is to just stick everything into one ungodly bundle.
Yeah.
For each thing. Like, what does that look like as far as like the ecosystem for that? Because it seems like at that point, really, you don't really want to do any of that. You don't want to really even do modules. You just want to build like here are all of entry points, and all I want to do is minify each of them.
Yeah. Yeah, so the question is kind of what do I do about Webpack, because it's kind of like taking everything and smashing it into one, and I being the guy with the microphone just told you to stop doing that. So I would take the approach, or I would take the opinion rather, that we're kind of moving in this direction already. Like React kind of naturally has this like componentized idea where it's not necessarily view plus, you know, and logic, the separation. It's more, you know, componentized. And I would actually tell you to still minify your files, but do it kind of along those same boundaries, right? So like kind of break up your Webpack into smaller packages and have more of them. Obviously there is diminishing returns, and obviously that'll get obnoxious. So of course there's like, you know, at some point you've gone too far, but I would kind of start moving in that direction.
So if I go to my browser and check my site and say, oh, it looks like I'm connecting over HTTP 2.
Yeah.
Does that mean that considering that all the browsers are compatible, that almost everyone I can be confident that everyone accessing my site is using HTTP 2 or I should say H2,
Yeah.
and therefore I can start changing my bundling tactics, and I can feel confident I'm not harming users that may not have that connection?
Yeah, so the question is essentially if you visit your site and it says it's H2, can you be confident that all of your customers will already support H2? Yes? So H2 was proposed in 2015 and as a follow-up to Speedy, so it's not all that new. And it really is pretty already accepted just about everywhere. Like there's no modern browsers that don't support it. And I'm guessing that they've supported it at least a year, at least most of them. Like everyone pretty much jumped on it pretty quick. It's actually it started as a protocol called Speedy from Google, and it kind of morphed and grew into H2. And so there was a lot of adoption already just for Speedy, and obviously Chrome is now like the winner of the browser war. So, you know, kind of what they do, everyone kind of has to follow very, very quickly. So that's good and bad, we could argue that, but the good part of it is that if they do a thing, kind of everyone has to do it. And I think they did for the most part. So I would be pretty confident, but I would be confident that the overwhelming majority, and as much as I hate for anyone to have a bad performance or a bad experience by performance, I think that the chances that that population would be very large is very small. Does that make sense?
So it's like an interesting case where like everyone's using H2, and because we've been doing it a certain way, almost everyone in that case is currently using tactics that's harming their harming
Yes,
their
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, really, and I pointed out the fact that there are people, I am willing to bet there are people in this room that are actually doing performance wrong because H2 is turned on and they never knew about it because it's completely invisible, right? So that's very much you know, a very interesting point that, yeah, everything kind of went upside down as far as optimizing for performance.
I'm curious if there are any like theoretical practical ones to help you request contaminate more of the same kind.
You're asking if there are any limitations to how many requests?
Or typical configuration.
Yeah. I don't know off the top of my head if there are limitations on how many requests you can jam into a single request. I know that you could probably hurt yourself answering that question. But again, it's important to note that that's one of the big reasons why there's resource prioritization. So that even if you do try to test the upper limits of that, you can at least do it in such a way that you're not really killing your experience, right? You can kind of tell it, hey, fonts and CSS, those things first, right?
How well do CDNs handle the resource prioritization?
That is a great question served up by my weak-armed softball throwing friend. So the question was, how many CDNs support resource prioritization? Or how well do they? How well do they? So the typical answer is, yeah, pretty well. Not too great, but okay. Some better than others. The shocking omission to that, and I think this is the answer that you actually wanted, is that AWS or Amazon CloudFront does not support it at all. And holy crap, write your sales representatives right now and tell them to start supporting it because that's awful. Like they're the only ones that just don't at all. And they're the big ones. Like that's ridiculous. Ridiculous. Anyway.
Are you able to show us how we would, like, one, diagnose whether a site supports H2?
Yes.
And how we would diagnose, like, per request, what's using H2 and what isn't?
Absolutely. I will do all of those things. So the question or the request was, can I demonstrate how to tell if a site uses H2 already? Yeah? So, oh God, what am I doing? So yeah, so essentially if you go to someplace, and I actually tripped on this, I've given this talk once before, and I got this same question, and I love this question. Thank you for asking it. And I tripped on a thing, and I'm going to do it on purpose because that's how I do. So yeah, so we're just going to go into the Chrome DevTools real quick and have the network tab open and not do that. And then just go to Google. And we're going to go over to Google and look at the network tools. And we're going to notice a thing that there's this protocol tab column.
Can you make it bigger?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so there's a protocol column in the Chrome DevTools right here. And you'll notice that this does not say H2. It actually says something entirely different, which is Google's next protocol, which is called Quick, which I'll be giving a talk on in 6 months. No, it's so much like Google made the, oh God, what did I do? Google made the Speedy, which turned into H2. They're made Quick, which is likely to turn into H3. So this is the landmine that I actually fell on giving this talk before because, of course, Google owns Chrome and Google owns Google Chrome. So, you know, that supports Quick already. But if you go to something like CNN, you'll see that this actually now shows H2 as the protocol.
Except for the Amazon resource.
Except for the Amazon stuff, which is, oh my God, that's HTTP 1. Okay, that's terrible. Yeah, there's no excuse for that. What is this? Wow, okay.
So with something like Netflix, where they break up the video chunks, and they'll, if you look and inspect and see them coming through,
Yeah.
it just makes a lot of quick burst requests for, you know, the next 15 seconds, the next 15 seconds. Would that keep a TCP connection open? So you would have this long-running connection, like for the duration of the movie, if it's active the whole way through?
Yeah, so the question is about Netflix and how they do video streaming, and does it help with that because it can keep the connection open and do like bursts of video, like 15 seconds or whatever number of seconds at a time? My answer to that is run for the hills and don't try to guess what Netflix does because they have an ungodly amount of resources and people to do smarter things that I could ever possibly guess. If I were them, I would be rolling in a pile of money.
One thing that I could say that we do, so we use HLS with a lot of companies too. We try to take as advantage of that as possible by that first one. And we will actually, we have a pre-fetching scheme on our site so that the video starts to go really quickly. And that's been helped out quite a bit.
Yeah, so that's, you can talk to him, guy from NPR. Or TED Talk, rather.
And another question on the actual TCP connection, does that get terminated at the Nginx side, or does it go all the way into rack?
Yeah. So yeah, if you put, if you have Nginx handling your H2, yeah, both SSL and H2 would be terminated at Nginx, and then Nginx will talk whatever you have it talk, you know, over a socket or over HTTP, like whatever you have that configured to hit your origin. CDNs would be, again, like however you have your CDN configured, but.
So it would actually keep a connection open from the Nginx to the Puma or
Yeah.
the Passenger or the rack app?
Yeah, so that will behave exactly as it does now, and I imagine that there's a lot of configuration about that to be accurate. Kind of depends on what you do. But to answer I think the spirit of the question, the connection, the H2 connection will stop at Nginx, and if Nginx is talking to rack, that's not going to be H2, right?
Yeah, because a few years ago when Action Controller Live came out, that was like this big bad of you can keep this connection open from the passenger side or the Puma side, the actual application server, and it would just keep that connection open. The problem with that was that it used up one of your resources, connections, and the actual application server only has a very small number that it can handle concurrently, and you would essentially run out of resources to serve other requests.
Yeah. Yeah, and that whole thing is exactly why I kind of think it's better to have it terminate at like an Nginx or a CDN level. That way you're not holding a thread open, essentially waiting for a resource request that may never show up or almost certainly won't show up because they've already left the page, right? So it's especially in the Ruby world, it seems like it's way better to not deal with that in Puma or Passenger or Rack, just farm that out to something else. It's a lot of the same challenges that came up with WebSockets, right? Because like it's essentially the same kind of a scheme, just at a lower level protocol, where it's breaking things up, it's keeping connections open, and it's sending frames back and forth. So.
The verge of being a stupid question. Follow up on this. So you're terminating an Nginx. If your Nginx H2 connection to Nginx is H2 instead of HTTP 1.1, and you're making routing decisions like this location goes to this rack app, this location goes to this other rack app, this other location goes to this other thing behind the reverse proxy, is there any damage or difference from that connection being the big fat H2 connection versus being smaller once routed?
Yeah, so the scheme being painted in there is one big TCP connection to rack making multiple like HTTP1 or any other kind of connections to multiple origins. How does that affect sending resources back and forth?
Yeah.
I don't think it makes much of a difference. It will reuse that single connection because again, it is kind of two sides of this this thing, and there is kind of a pretty clear delineation between one connection versus one side of the connection thing versus another. And in fact, Nginx will do even smarter than that and share the same connections to your origins across multiple requests, across multiple clients, right? So it's even better than that, even smarter than that. Yeah, so if you have something like Nginx or even like a CDN for that matter that has you're accepting multiple connections from your clients, from browsers to that Nginx or CDN, that is then going to turn around and create connections, HTTP1 connections potentially, to your origin, to your actual app server, right? Those connections to your app server will actually be shared across multiple visitors to your site. That is true right now. without H2. That's true right now. Like Nginx, CDNs, they will all do that kind of connection sharing where they will essentially route internally, like through like memory routing, like route requests through already established connections. And a lot of it is to avoid the TCP slow starts and all that kind of stuff, the penalties of making those connections. It doesn't want to, flood your origin with a ton of requests and take on a penalty. Instead, if there's a connection already available, it'll just reuse it. And so I think I'm willing to bet that in most cases, if not all cases, that exactly the same benefit would be true in H2. One big fat connection for a client, essentially multiple connections are already open to the origin, it's going to reuse those connections.
This does bring up an interesting question about if you use H2 and you're running a request that goes straight to your Rails app.
We can't do it right now.
But through Nginx,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it's going to get routed through Nginx, and you're piping through multiple requests. What is the impact, I guess, on the of how like Nginx proxies those requests to that rack app, right?
Yeah, I mean that is one of the benefits of a thing like Nginx or Apache is that it is pooling those fixed connections.
Where like say you have your Luma has like 4 handlers, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you have four requests going through one H2 pipe, and it's going straight to through Nginx straight to your server, and bypassing the load balancer, a front-end load balancer.
Yeah.
What's happening is that you're overloading your Rails server.
I would suggest you not throw out your load balancer in this scenario.
But so I guess the load balancer would have to be able to manage those connections.
Sure.
Different Nginxes within one HTTP2 connection.
Sure, so yeah, I don't think that the load balancer equation to that will change at all because load balancers are typically not inspecting or terminating HTTP connections or even like, they're essentially routing packets. They're a little bit more.
They're going to route. So what I'm wondering is that they're going to be routing the same through one pipe. They're going to route requests through one specific node, right?
Sure.
You're effectively becoming instantly sticky, it sounds like.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That connection becomes sticky.
Well, not necessarily. Like it could reroute, like you're saying if one client is connected to a load balancer and it's connected to Nginx and it's connected to your origin, does that mean that that client has to follow exactly the same path even though there are multiple forking places? And I think the answer is actually no, that it can actually, additional requests could change and take different paths, right? Like that's the very idea of a thing like Nginx and a thing like a load balancer is that it can make those decisions on a packet by packet
But if you're
basis.
routing like 4 shared requests to the same Rails server, is it going to serialize those requests to that?
Yeah, it could send them to 4 different threads. It could send them to 4 different instances behind your load balancer. Yeah, like it could absolutely spread the load
You
out.
could also put a load balancer behind Nginx to proxy from. You see what I mean?
I still don't think it's a big deal because like, yeah, you might want to stick whatever is terminating your H2 like at the outermost. And if you're doing SSL termination, that's going to be the thing that terminates H2 as well. So if that's the outermost thing, which is a lot of cases your load balancer, then you're kind of already doing it the way that I think you're describing it.
I kind of see what you're talking about, like one case where perhaps you have like some sort of hungry metrics collection, and it's just all in one packet, and it's going really, really rapid. So you have use case where packets get top of something.
Well, I'm going to stick a fork in this. Thank you guys for coming. I'm hanging out, so come talk to me. If you want parking validation, I'm also the person you want to talk to. So, yeah, all the things. Thanks a lot.